Mommy, I want to have a friend so much. You can't even imagine how. And the girls don't want to be friends with me. If I had a doll, then I would be friends with her, and I would walk with her, and we wouldn't be sad with her while you were at work. Betty sighed. She would have brought Gillian all over the world if she had the money for it. And there was no money at all. And the cleaning lady's salary was only enough to pay for that little room and buy the essentials of food. Daughter, you will surely have a doll and a friend. Gil clung to her mother. Mommy, I'll put up with it. I know we don't have any money, but when I grow up, I'll be sure to get rich, and then I'll buy lots and lots of dolls. Betty wanted to cry. She's the bad mother. She's the only one who can't provide for her child. In fact, life is so unfair. Betty had always lived poorly. Her parents had lost confidence when the only big factory in town simply shut down, even though their salaries had been paid in parts lately, and not all of them. And one day, everyone came to work and the doors were closed. Some said that the plants, or rather its owner, had simply gone bankrupt. Some said that the new owner had lost it in a game of cards. And only 6 months later, they began to talk openly about the fact that the owner of the factory had lost his wife and daughter. Betty was about 7 or 8 at the time, and she could hear her parents in the kitchen opening a bottle of strong liquor talking about it. And what? No trace? None. Can you imagine? They were just taking a walk in the park. Oh, times have come. Yeah, it's a shame about the girl. She was only 7 years old. And there's no one left? There's somebody left. His older daughter or hers. Well, it doesn't make any sense. Maybe someone else will come along and the factory will start up again. I don't know, but I don't think so. It's been almost 2 months. You understand that no one has made any demands in that time, so they didn't kidnap them to get the ransom back. What are we supposed to do? If the factory doesn't work, what do we have to live on? Well, we'll find something. Find what? What can we find in our town? Absolutely nothing, and you know it. The factory never opened, and the parents were struggling to support themselves and their daughter. The money came only from occasional earnings, and it was spent on bottles of alcohol. The mother cried, the father was depressed, and they were happy only when there was something to drink in the house. Alcohol was almost always there, but little Betty was completely forgotten. The girl hardly studied at all, getting her own food, and she didn't like going to school. Everyone, both students and teachers, harassed her, and her clothes were old, mostly dirty. Her parents were gone when she came of age, and she miraculously survived. Her father brought some counterfeit alcohol. They all drank it together, went to bed, and her parents didn't wake up the next morning. And Betty only survived because she was young, and she hadn't had much to drink, and she started drinking with them only recently. After leaving the hospital, Betty realized that she did not want to live the way her parents had been living lately, but she did not know how to get out of this vicious circle either. Betty tried to get a job. Employment in their town had always been difficult, and it wasn't even the size of the town that mattered, but rather the times. The recession was in full swing, and Betty was, to put it mildly, very much at a disadvantage compared to the other applicants. Besides, she had practically no education other than high school. She had a lot of debt piled up for her apartment, and she didn't know what to do. But then, a man in a nice leather jacket showed up and offered to change her apartment for another. It will be smaller, but already cheaper, and you will get more money. Of course, Betty agreed. How could she not believe such a man? So Betty ended up in this little room on the edge of town, and with absolutely no money. Then after 6 months, maybe more, she managed to get a job as a cleaner. The pay was small, but if she worked without days off, she could live. She lived and lived, except that by chance she had a daughter, Gil. The suitor who promised Betty a beautiful life turned out to be married, and Betty did not suffer that he left. He had beaten her badly, and she thought he should have. Betty looked at her daughter, who was asleep, and went behind the curtain that separated the corner, which was something like a kitchen. She sat down in a chair, cried for a long time. Now that she was 28 and life had never even begun, and now it was unlikely to begin. Betty looked at her hands. The skin was cracked, her nails were crumbling. Well, what would happen to them if she constantly washed rags in dirty cold water? And tomorrow is her Gillian's birthday. Betty has some money set aside, just enough for a cake. Well, maybe a bag of candy. Oh, whatever may come. She took Gillian to kindergarten in the morning. At least the office had that benefit, and ran to the bazaar herself. Betty didn't know what she wanted to find there, but she hoped she could find a friend for her daughter, at least at the flea market. She noticed the doll immediately. It was obviously expensive, but now it looked more like a dirty lump. Betty made an indifferent face and turned to the old woman who sold all sorts of rags. "How much is it?" The old woman glared at the doll. "Take it for $2. I've been wearing it for 3 months just like that. If I had known, I never would have picked it up." Betty almost shrieked with joy. It's much less than she planned to pay, and still for the cake. She almost ran home, heated some water, got some soap, and now she'd washed it well, and the doll would be beautiful. The woman began to take off her dress carefully, and when she did, she saw a pocket on the doll. Moreover, it was clearly not sewn by adult hands. Stitches are uneven, crooked, and maybe it's not a pocket, a patch. Oh, it doesn't matter. It needs to be stitched neatly anyway. She pulled the thread and ripped it off. And what the hell is this? In the pocket was a folded handkerchief, very pretty. You could tell it was expensive, and on it was written, "My sister killed us," and signed, "Jean Hawkins." Betty's heart was pounding somewhere in her throat. Jean Hawkins? Jean Hawkins? And then it hit her. She dropped the doll and clasped her hand over her mouth. Good heavens, that's Mr. Archibald Hawkins' daughter. Betty realized she was holding the doll of the girl who had gone missing years before. Back then, just then, the factory where her parents worked had closed. And what if it really was? Betty didn't know what to do. Archibald Hawkins wasn't going anywhere. He was still living in their town. He'd had another business a long time ago. At first, they still talked about him, that he was a recluse, that he didn't go anywhere, and then they stopped. He is what he is. No one sees him. No one hears him. Yeah, but if she went to him and it wasn't true, things could get worse in her life, and Gillian would be left without a presence. She hid the handkerchief to herself, and she washed the doll after all. Just as she thought, when the doll was clean, it looked gorgeous. Gillian could not believe her eyes when her mother gave her the gifts. She screamed with joy, and Betty was frightened. "Gil, don't scream like that." "Mom, I have a friend now, and she's so beautiful, the prettiest." 2 weeks went by. Betty honestly couldn't eat or sleep. She kept dreaming about the little girl who kept asking her, "Find my daddy. Well, what do you have to do?" So she made up her mind. Leaving Gillian with a neighbor, Betty walked to the Hawkins house. She didn't know how she was going to meet him, but she decided she had to tell him everything, and then let him decide. There is no owner of the house, and you have nothing to talk to him about. The guard pushed her away from the entrance. "You think there is nothing to talk about, but I know there is." "You tell me, I'll tell him." "No, I'll only talk to him personally." While they were arguing, they didn't notice a car stop at the gate. "Arthur, what have you got there?" "Excuse me, Archibald Hawkins here, reaching out to you." A man got out of the car. Very thin eyes said, "Who are you?" "I'm Betty, and I have something to tell you." "Well, tell me." "I can't, just you. Let's step back, shall we?" The man looked intently at the woman's worried face, turned to the security guard. "Arthur, get the car." Tossed him the keys and turned to Betty. "Well?" "It's my daughter's birthday. I couldn't afford a new doll." Betty spoke, and Archibald looked at her incomprehensively. Betty held out a handkerchief to him. "Here's what I found in that pocket. I don't know if it has anything to do with you, but I thought I'd show it just in case." The man turned completely pale, then turned the handkerchief over, and in one corner he saw the initials, real ones. The handkerchiefs were made especially for them. He said in a husky voice, "Follow me." They entered the house, and Betty immediately exclaimed, "Here, that's exactly the kind of doll. Only you have the big one and the little one, and the one I bought is like the middle one. The middle one." He swayed. That's exactly the kind of doll his daughter was missing. Archibald realized that if things were as he now thought they were, this woman, and most likely her daughter, would simply not live. From there, it was like a dream. Betty was put in the car. Arthur was told exactly what to do. They drove to Betty's house, picked up Gillian, and drove off again. "We should at least get stuff." "No need. Mr. Archibald Hawkins said to buy all the necessities." They were put up in a beautiful country house. Arthur stayed with them. Betty and Gillian had many new things. Their refrigerator was full of food, and Arthur entertained them with interesting conversations in the evenings. Betty couldn't understand why she didn't like him at first. 2 weeks passed, and Betty became worried. "Arthur, how much longer do we have to be here? I understand that Mr. Hawkins is settling his problems, but I'll lose my job, and what will I live on?" "Don't worry, Archibald won't leave you on the street. Read books, watch TV." He didn't finish. A car pulled up to the house. Arthur immediately drew his weapon, but then relaxed. "There, now we'll find out." Archibald Hawkins entered the house, took a seat. "Well, hello." Gillian was playing in the courtyard, and seeing that she was gone, he spoke. "Thank you very much, Betty, for not being afraid. At least now I know where my daughter and wife are buried." Betty gasped. "God, I wish I hadn't come." "You're wrong. You have no idea how hard it is when you don't know where they are, what's wrong with them, how they live, who's around. Maybe they're being tortured." Betty was silent, and Archibald continued. "I am very grieved. My heart is torn, but now I can come to them and talk to them. Yes, it was true on the handkerchief. Our eldest daughter set it all up. My wife and I hadn't had children for a long time. We got her from an orphanage. We never told her about it. How she found out, I still don't know. And she decided when Jean was born that we were going to leave her without everything." Gillian ran into the room. "Hello." "Hello, baby." Gillian walked over to her mother. "Mommy, do we have to go back there, home again?" "Of course, Gil." The girl sighed. Archibald gestured to Arthur, who jumped out into the street, returned with a bag. "Gillian, isn't that your name?" "Yes." "Come to me." Gillian timidly approached. "Here you go. It's for your kit." He pulled 2 dolls exactly like the one in Gillian's hand out of the bag. The girl's eyes lit up. "They're so beautiful." "Go play." "Betty, this house is yours, just like the apartment in town I bought for you. There's money here. You have to hire a nanny and tutor for the girl, and you have to study yourself or you'll waste your whole life." Betty looked at him without blinking. "Don't look at me like that. It's nothing to me, and it will help you get out of the abyss." "Thank you." "Yes, I'll leave Arthur with you for now. He'll help, he'll tell you." Arthur smiled. If he could, he would stay with Betty forever. At first, she had seemed too simple, even a little silly, but now, he could see how romantic and vulnerable she was. And next to such must be a man, a real man, who can protect and make happy. A year later, Betty, a college student, mother, and just a beautiful woman, was standing at the entrance to the church in her wedding dress. Husband-to-be Arthur was waiting for her at the altar. Betty thought that miracles do happen. You just have to wait a little longer. She smiled and walked to the music to her happiness.